Connor Blake stood in the empty chapel, looking at the single wreath beside a modest casket, wondering how a man who had quietly changed so many lives could die with no one to witness his final goodbye. The janitor, who had mopped these floors for 30 years, had left behind something far more valuable than anyone realized. Something that would shake Connor to his core and transform not just his company, but his understanding of what true leadership really meant. But, as he prepared to speak to an audience of empty chairs, one question haunted him. How had he missed the extraordinary man who walked his halls every single day? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The notification appeared on Connor Blake's phone at exactly 9:47 on a Tuesday morning, buried beneath 17 other emails about quarterly projections and board meeting agendas. It was from Human Resources, marked with the kind of formal subject line that usually meant paperwork and protocol. Employee death notification, Harold Jensen, custodial services. Connor almost deleted it without reading, his finger hovering over the trash icon as he sat in his corner office 30 floors above the bustling streets of downtown Chicago. The autumn sun streamed through floor-till-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across his mahogany desk, where contracts worth millions of dollars waited for his signature. But something made him pause. Harold Jensen. The name felt familiar in the way that distant memories do, like a song you've heard but can't quite place. Connor opened the email and read the brief, sterile language that reduced a human life to a few essential facts. Harold Jensen, age 68, had worked in custodial services at Blake Industries for 30 years. No surviving family listed. Services to be held Thursday at 2 p.m. at Riverside Memorial Chapel. The company would send the standard condolence arrangement. Connor leaned back in his leather chair, trying to place the name with a face. Blake Industries employed over 3,000 people across 4 buildings, and Connor prided himself on knowing the key players, the department heads, the rising stars who caught his attention in meetings and presentations. But custodial services, that was different territory entirely. Those were the invisible people, the ones who worked while others slept, who kept the machinery of business running without fanfare or recognition. Yet something about Harold Jensen nagged at him. Connor closed his eyes and tried to remember. Late nights at the office, working past midnight on deals that would make or break quarters, and always, there had been quiet footsteps in the hallway. The soft swish of a mop, the gentle clink of keys, the almost imperceptible hum of someone who moved through the building like a ghost. Had that been Harold Jensen? Had they ever spoken? Connor's assistant, Patricia, knocked and entered without waiting for permission, a privilege earned through 12 years of flawless efficiency. "The Morrison files are ready for your signature," she said, placing a stack of documents on his desk. Then she paused, noticing the email still open on his computer screen. "Oh, you heard about Mr. Jensen. You knew him?" Connor asked, surprised by the familiarity in her voice. Patricia's expression softened. Everyone knew Harold. He was just always there. Such a kind man. She hesitated, as if debating whether to say more. "It's sad, really. I called the chapel this morning to see about sending flowers from the company, and they said it doesn't look like anyone else will be attending." Connor felt something twist in his stomach. No one? Apparently he didn't have any family left. And I guess, you know how it is with the cleaning staff. People see them, but they don't really see them, if you understand what I mean. Connor understood exactly what she meant, and the understanding made him uncomfortable. In his world of power lunches and strategic partnerships, the Harold Jensens of the company were background noise, essential but unnoticed, like the hum of air conditioning or the glow of emergency exit signs. They kept the world functioning, but they did it invisibly. That evening, Connor found himself walking through the empty halls of Blake Industries long after most employees had gone home. He told himself he was doing his usual end-of-day walkthrough, checking that everything was secure, but really he was looking for traces of Harold Jensen. In the 37th floor break room, he paused beside the coffee station. The counter was spotless, the coffee pot gleaming, everything arranged with the kind of care that spoke of pride and work well done. A small handwritten note was taped beside the sugar dispenser. Fresh coffee every morning at 6 a.m., cream restocked daily, please enjoy. The handwriting was careful, old-fashioned, the kind taught in schools before computers made penmanship obsolete. Connor stared at the note, wondering how many mornings he had grabbed coffee from this station without ever thinking about who prepared it, who made sure it was perfect every single day for 30 years. He continued his walk, noticing things he had never seen before. In the supply closet on the 22nd floor, boxes were labeled not just with contents, but with little notes about usage. Printer paper, heavy stock for presentations; copy paper, perfect for daily reports; recycled paper, great for drafts and internal memos. Someone had taken the time to make the mundane helpful, to anticipate the needs of people who would never know his name. The security guard, Miguel, was making his rounds when Connor encountered him near the elevator bank. "Mr. Blake, working late again?" Miguel asked with the respectful familiarity of someone who had seen Connor's nocturnal habits for years. "Miguel, did you know Harold Jensen?" Miguel's weathered face brightened, and then fell. "Harold? Of course. Terrible thing, him passing like that. Heart attack right there in the parking garage, they said. Just finishing up his shift, probably heading home to that little apartment of his." Miguel shook his head. 30 years he worked here. 30 years. And I bet half the people in this building couldn't tell you his name. What was he like? Harold? Man, where do I start? Miguel leaned against the wall, settling in for a story. You know how some people just make everything better by being around? That was Harold. He knew everyone's name, everyone's story. Sarah in accounting, when she was going through her divorce last year and couldn't afford a lawyer. Harold somehow connected her with his cousin who does legal aid work. Never said a word about it, but I found out because Sarah told me she didn't know how she would have managed without that help. Connor felt a strange sensation in his chest, like a door opening that he hadn't known was closed. And Tommy in maintenance, Miguel continued. When his kid got into trouble with drugs, Harold was the one who drove into those meetings every week. NA meetings, I think. Never missed one. Harold didn't. Sat in the parking lot for an hour every Tuesday night, waiting to drive that boy home. Tommy's kid is clean now, has been A for 8 months, got a job at a garage downtown. Harold did all that? That was just how he was. You know how he always worked the night shift? I asked him once why he didn't try to get moved to days, and he said he liked the quiet hours, because it gave him time to think about people. Said he could get more done for folks when the building was empty, and he could focus on what they needed instead of just what they wanted. Connor walked home that night, instead of calling his driver, needing the 40-minute journey through the city streets to process what he was learning. Chicago moved around him, in its familiar rhythm. Traffic lights cycling through their colors. People hurrying past with their own urgent purposes. Everyone focused on their own small corner of the vast urban machine. Connor had always seen the city from above, from boardroom windows and private elevators. But tonight he walked among it, part of the ground-level flow of ordinary life. His penthouse apartment felt unusually empty when he arrived. Connor poured himself 2 fingers of scotch and stood at his living room window, looking down at the lights of the city spread below him like a circuit board. Somewhere down there, Harold Jensen had lived his quiet life, had made his small difference in the world without fanfare or recognition. Connor had built an empire, had his name on buildings and in business journals, had more money than he could spend in 3 lifetimes. But what legacy was he leaving? What would people say about him when he was gone? The next morning, Connor arrived at the office earlier than usual and called Patricia into his office. I want you to find out everything you can about Harold Jensen, he told her. I want to know about his work here, about the people he helped, about who he was as a person. Patricia looked surprised but nodded. Of course, Mr. Blake. May I ask why? Because I think we missed something important, Connor said. I think we all missed something very important. Over the next 2 days, Patricia compiled a file that astonished Connor. Harold Jensen's employee reviews were remarkable, not for their glowing praise, though that was certainly there, but for the consistency of comments that painted a picture of someone who went far beyond his job. Description: always willing to help. Appeared in review after review. goes the extra mile, makes everyone feel valued, the kind of employee every company dreams of having. But the real revelations came from the interviews Patricia conducted with current and former employees. The stories poured out once people realized someone was listening. Harold had organized a toy drive every Christmas, not through official company channels, but quietly, person by person, making sure children of struggling employees would have presents under the tree. He had started an informal lending library in the break room on the 15th floor, bringing in books from garage sales and used bookstores because he noticed people looked stressed and thought reading might help them unwind. Jennifer Martinez from the marketing department told Patricia about the time her mother was in the hospital, and she was spending every evening there, missing dinner and surviving on vending machine food. Harold had started bringing her sandwiches, good sandwiches from a deli near his apartment, wrapped in paper with little notes that said things like, "Hope your mom is feeling better," and "Take care of yourself too." He did it for 6 weeks, until her mother recovered, and never once made her feel like she owed him anything. David Chen from IT Services had a story about his first day on the job, 5 years earlier, when he was young and nervous and intimidated by the corporate environment. Harold had found him eating lunch alone in the parking garage, hiding from the social dynamics he didn't understand, and had sat with him. They talked for 30 minutes about nothing important, about the weather and the Cubs, and the best places to get deep dish pizza in the city. But David said it was the conversation that made him feel like he could belong at Blake Ebola Industries. Harold checked on him every day for his first month. Just a quick hello and a smile, until David found his footing. The list went on. Carol in Human Resources, whose car broke down and who couldn't afford repairs, found an envelope under her keyboard one Monday morning with enough cash to fix the transmission, and a note that said simply, "Pay it forward when you can." She never knew for certain it was Harold, but she suspected, and years later when she was in a position to help someone else, she remembered the kindness. Marcus Johnson, a security guard who worked weekends, told Patricia about the time Harold found him studying for his college courses during quiet hours at the security desk. Harold had been a voracious reader, it turned out, and he started bringing Marcus books that related to his coursework, books he found at library sales and used bookstores. When Marcus struggled with a particularly difficult economics class, Harold connected him with his neighbor, a retired professor who was willing to tutor in exchange for help with yard work. Marcus graduated with his business degree 8 months ago and had just been promoted to a management position with another company. Cotter read every story, every interview note, every small act of kindness that Patricia documented. A picture emerged of a man who had moved through Blake Industries like a guardian angel, seeing needs that others missed, connecting people with resources they didn't know existed, providing support that was invisible to everyone except those who needed it most. Harold Jensen had been running his own private nonprofit organization, using his salary and his spare time and his network of connections to make life better for people who crossed his path. On Thursday morning, Connor stood in his closet, choosing what to wear to Harold Jensen's funeral. He selected a dark blue suit, conservative and respectful, then changed his mind and chose the charcoal gray one that made him look less intimidating. Then he changed again, settling on a simple black suit that wouldn't draw attention. He was surprised by how nervous he felt. Connor Blake had spoken at corporate gatherings and charity galas, had given interviews to major business publications, had testified before Congress about industry regulations. But the thought of speaking at a funeral for a man he had barely known while he was alive filled him with an anxiety he couldn't quite name. Riverside Memorial Chapel was a modest building tucked between a dry cleaner and a flower shop in a neighborhood that had seen better days. Connor's driver offered to wait, but Connor told him to go, that he would find his own way back. The chapel's interior was simple but dignified, with dark wooden pews and stained glass windows that cast colored light across the floor. At the front of the room, Harold Jensen's casket sat surrounded by more flowers than Connor had expected. Patricia had been busy, apparently, and so had others who had heard about the service. Connor was surprised to find he wasn't alone. About 20 people sat scattered among the pews, more than Patricia had predicted, but still a small gathering for a man who had touched so many lives. Connor recognized some faces from the building, employees who had taken time off work to pay their respects. Miguel was there in a suit that looked like it had seen service at many funerals and weddings over the years. Jennifer Martinez sat in the third row with a woman who might have been her mother, the one Harold had helped through those difficult hospital weeks. The service was conducted by a chaplain who clearly had not known Harold personally, but who spoke with genuine warmth about the importance of ordinary people who do extraordinary things without recognition. Connor listened to the generic words and felt frustrated that they captured nothing of the man he had discovered over the past few days. When the chaplain asked if anyone would like to share memories, the chapel fell silent. Connor stood up, his decision surprising him as much as anyone else. He walked to the front of the chapel and turned to face the small gathering, these people who had been touched by Harold Jensen's quiet kindness. For a moment, words failed him. He had not prepared remarks, had not expected to speak, but something inside him demanded that Harold's story be told properly. "I didn't know Harold Jensen," Connor began, his voice carrying clearly in the quiet space. "I'm Connor Blake, and Harold worked at my company for 30 years, and I am ashamed to say that I never really knew him. I knew of him in the way that you know about the plumbing in your house or the engine in your car, essential things that you take for granted until they stop working. But I didn't know Harold the man. Harold the person who made everyone around him a little bit better." Connor paused, looking at the faces watching him. Miguel nodded encouragingly. "Over the past few days, I've been learning about Harold Jensen, and what I've learned has humbled me and challenged me, and made me think about what it means to lead, what it means to serve, what it means to make a difference in the world. Harold never had a corner office, or a company car, or stock options. His name wasn't on any buildings or in any newspaper articles. But Harold Jensen built something more valuable than any corporation, more lasting than any financial empire. He built a network of kindness, a web of connections that made dozens of people's lives better in ways that mattered deeply to them." End quote. Connor told them about the stories he had heard, about Jennifer's sandwiches and David's first-day conversation, and Marcus's tutoring, and Sarah's legal help. He spoke about the coffee station notes, and the toy drives, and the lending library, and the countless small acts of generosity that had gone unnoticed by the company's leadership, but had been life-changing for the people who received them. "Harold Jensen understood something that I'm only beginning to grasp," Connor continued, his voice gaining strength as he found his rhythm. "He understood that leadership isn't about titles, or salaries, or the size of your office. Leadership is about seeing people, really seeing them, and figuring out how you can help them be better, do better, feel better about their place in the world." Harold was a leader in the truest sense of the word, and he did it without anyone giving him permission, or recognition, or reward. Connor looked at the casket, at the simple arrangement of flowers, at the modest setting that seemed so inadequate for the man being honored. "I built Blake Industries to be successful, to be profitable, to be competitive in the marketplace, and we achieved those goals. But Harold Jensen built something more important inside our company. He built community. He built connections. He built a culture of caring that existed completely separate from our official policies and procedures and corporate value statements. He did it quietly, person by person, relationship by relationship, one act of kindness at a time." End quote. The chapel was completely silent now. Everyone focused on Connor's words. Harold Jensen's legacy isn't in any annual report or financial statement. His legacy is in the lives he touched, the people he helped, the difference he made when no one was watching and no one was keeping score. And that legacy challenges all of us to think about what we're building with our own lives, what kind of difference we're making in the world, whether we're using whatever power and resources we have to lift other people up or just to advance ourselves. Connor felt emotion rising in his throat and took a moment to compose himself. "I never got the chance to thank Harold Jensen while he was alive, and that will always be one of my biggest regrets. But I can honor his memory by trying to follow his example, by paying attention to the people around me, by using my position to serve others the way Harold served everyone who crossed his path. And I can make sure that Harold's legacy lives on in a concrete way that helps other people, the way Harold helped so many of you." Connor looked directly at the small gathering, making eye contact with as many people as he could. Blake Industries has a mentorship fund that provides scholarships and professional development opportunities for employees who are working to better themselves. Starting today, that fund will be renamed the Harold Jensen Memorial Fund, and it will be expanded significantly to help more people pursue education, training, and career advancement. But more than that, we're going to try to institutionalize the kind of caring and attention that Harold brought to his work every day. We're going to create formal programs to connect employees who need help with resources and support. We're going to make sure that Harold's approach to treating people with dignity and respect becomes part of our company's official culture, not just something that happens when we're lucky enough to have someone like Harold working among us. Connor paused, looking around the chapel one more time. Harold Jensen showed us what it looks like to live a life of service, a life focused on making other people's lives better. He did it without recognition, without reward, without anyone telling him it was his job. He did it because he understood something that I'm still learning, that our purpose in life isn't just to succeed for ourselves, but to help others succeed as well. That the measure of a life well lived isn't in what you accumulate, but in what you give away. That leadership is fundamentally about service, and service is fundamentally about love. Connor's voice broke slightly on the last word, and he took a deep breath. I didn't know Harold Jensen the way I should have, but I know him now through the stories of the people he helped, through the legacy of kindness he left behind. And I promise you that I will spend the rest of my career trying to honor that legacy, trying to be the kind of leader that Harold Jensen would have been if anyone had ever given him the title and the resources to match his natural gifts. Connor returned to his seat, emotionally drained but somehow also energized. The chaplain offered a few closing words. And then the small service was over. People filed out slowly, many stopping to speak with Connor, to share their own brief memories of Harold, to express gratitude that someone had finally recognized what they had always known about the man who cleaned their offices and made their work lives better. Miguel clasped Connor's hand firmly. Harold would have been proud to hear those words, he said. He always said the best leaders are the ones who don't know they're leaders, who just do what needs doing without thinking about titles or credit. Sounds like maybe you're starting to understand what he meant. Jennifer Martinez approached with tears in her eyes. Thank you for seeing him, she said simply. Thank you for helping the rest of us remember that we saw him too. After everyone had gone, Connor remained in the empty chapel for another 30 minutes. Sitting in the front pew and thinking about the man in the casket and the lessons he had learned too late to matter. The afternoon sun slanted through the stained glass windows, painting patterns of color on the floor that shifted and changed as clouds moved across the sky outside. Connor thought about his own legacy, about what people would say about him when his time came. He had built a successful company, had created jobs, had generated wealth for shareholders and employees alike. But had he built the kind of relationships that Harold Jensen had built? Had he touched individual lives in ways that mattered beyond the financial? Had he seen people, really seen them, the way Harold had seen everyone who crossed his path? The questions followed Connor home and stayed with him through the evening and into the next day. At the office, he found himself paying attention to things he had never noticed before. The way the security guards greeted employees by name, the careful attention to detail in the way the custodial staff arranged supplies and maintained common areas, the small courtesies that made the workplace function smoothly, performed by people whose names he didn't know, but whose work made everyone else's job possible. Connor asked Patricia to set up a meeting with the head of custodial services, a woman named Rosa Valdez, who had worked for the company for 15 years and had been Harold's supervisor for the last 8 of those years. Rosa came to Connor's office looking nervous, clearly wondering what the CEO could possibly want with someone from her department. I wanted to talk to you about Harold Jensen, Connor said, gesturing for Rosa to sit in one of the comfortable chairs near his desk, rather than across from him in the formal business arrangement. Rosa's expression softened. Immediately. Harold was special, she said. In 30 years of managing cleaning crews, I never had anyone like him. He cared about this place, about the people who worked here, in a way that went far beyond his job description. Tell me about that, Connor said, Rosa settled back in her chair, and Connor could see her relax as she began to share memories of Harold. Harold never called in sick, not once in the 8 years I supervised him. But it wasn't because he was never sick. It was because he said this place needed him, and he didn't want to let people down. He knew everyone's schedule, everyone's preferences. He knew that the lawyers on the 32nd floor liked their coffee extra hot, so he would brew a fresh pot at 9 p.m. when he knew they would be working late on cases. He knew that the marketing team had a presentation every third Thursday, so he would make sure their conference room was perfect, not just clean but arranged exactly the way they liked it. Rosa paused, smiling at the memory. But the thing about Harold that was really special was how he paid attention to people's needs that had nothing to do with cleaning. He noticed when someone seemed stressed or upset, and he would find ways to help that had nothing to do with his job. Like this one time, there was a young woman in accounting who was clearly having a hard time. Harold noticed she was staying late every night, looking overwhelmed and exhausted. Turns out she was trying to take care of her elderly father and work full-time, and she was drowning. Connor leaned forward, interested. Harold didn't just offer sympathy. He had a solution. His neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, was a retired nurse who was looking for part-time work, taking care of elderly people. Harold introduced them, and Mrs. Patterson started coming to help with the father a few hours each day. It solved the young woman's problem and gave Mrs. Patterson the income and purpose she was looking for. Harold saw a need, and he found a way to fill it, using connections and resources that had nothing to do with Blake Industries, but everything to do with Harold's understanding of how to help people. Rosa looked directly at Connor. That's the kind of person Harold was. He saw solutions where other people just saw problems, and he never wanted credit for any of it. I only found out about half the things he did because people would mention them to me, thanking me for having such a wonderful employee working for us. Connor spent an hour with Rosa, hearing story after story that reinforced what he had already learned about Harold Jensen. When the conversation ended, Connor asked Rosa what she thought Harold would have wanted as a memorial, what kind of tribute would have honored his approach to helping people. Rosa considered the question seriously. Harold would have wanted something practical, she said finally. Something that actually helped people, not something that just honored his memory. He was never interested in recognition for himself, but he was always interested in finding ways to make other people's lives better. That afternoon, Connor called a meeting with his senior staff, the vice presidents and department heads who helped run Blake Industries. These were the people who knew the company's operations inside and out, who understood both its strengths and its challenges. Connor had worked with most of them for years, but he found himself looking at them differently now, wondering how much attention they paid to the support staff, the behind-the-scenes employees who kept everything running smoothly. I want to talk to you about employee engagement and support systems, Connor began. Specifically, I want to talk about how we can do a better job of connecting employees who need help with resources and assistance. The executives looked puzzled. Employee engagement was typically handled by human resources, and they had programs and surveys and metrics that tracked how satisfied people were with their jobs. Connor could see them wondering why this was suddenly a priority requiring their attention. Connor told them about Harold Jensen, about the informal network of support and assistance he had created, about the dozens of employees he had helped over the years through his own initiative and connections. He watched their faces as he spoke, seeing surprise and recognition and, in some cases, embarrassment that they had missed what was happening right under their noses. "The question I have for all of you," Connor said when he finished Harold's story, "is how we can systematize the kind of attention and support that Harold provided naturally. How do we make it part of our official culture instead of depending on the exceptional kindness of individual employees?" The discussion that followed was one of the most productive conversations Connor had ever had with his leadership team. Ideas flowed freely as people began to understand what Connor was asking for and why it mattered. They talked about mentorship programs and employee assistance funds and formal channels for connecting people with resources. They discussed ways to train managers and supervisors to recognize when employees were struggling with personal or professional challenges. They explored partnerships with community organizations that could provide services and support that went beyond what the company could offer directly. Sarah Chen, the vice president of human resources, was particularly engaged. "We've always focused on benefits and compensation and professional development," she said. "But we haven't really thought systematically about the kind of personal support that can make the difference between an employee thriving and just surviving." Harold Jensen was providing social services, essentially connecting people with what they needed to solve problems that were affecting their ability to succeed at work and in life. End quote. David Rodriguez, who oversaw operations, nodded thoughtfully. "And the thing is, when people feel supported and cared for, they're more productive, more engaged, more loyal." Harold was probably doing more to improve employee retention and satisfaction than any of our official furl programs. The meeting ran long, as the group developed concrete plans for implementing Harold Jensen's approach on a company-wide scale. They would create an employee assistance coordinator position, someone whose job would be specifically to connect employees with resources and support. They would establish partnerships with local service organizations, legal aid clinics, healthcare providers, and educational institutions. They would train managers to recognize signs that employees might be struggling and to make appropriate referrals for help. Most importantly, they would create a culture where asking for help was seen as a sign of strength rather than weakness, where employees knew that the company cared about their success both professionally and personally. Over the following weeks, Connor found himself spending more time than ever before walking through the offices and facilities of Blake Industries, but now he was walking with purpose, paying attention to things he had previously overlooked. He learned the names of custodial staff and security guards and maintenance workers. He stopped to chat with employees at all levels, asking about their work, but also about their lives, their challenges, their goals. The response was remarkable. People seemed surprised but pleased that the CEO was taking a personal interest in them as individuals. Stories emerged of employees who were struggling with various challenges, from childcare issues to elder care responsibilities, to educational goals, to financial difficulties. Connor began to understand how many of his employees were dealing with complex personal situations that affected their ability to perform at work, and how little the company had been doing to acknowledge or address those realities. The Harold Jensen Memorial Fund was officially announced at the company's quarterly all-hands meeting. Connor spoke to the entire staff about Harold's legacy and the lessons he had learned from discovering the depth of Harold's impact on individual employees. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with many employees sharing their own memories of Harold's kindness and expressing enthusiasm for programs that would extend that kind of support more broadly. Marcus Johnson, the security guard who had received Harold's help with his college studies, approached Connor after the meeting. "Mr. Blake, I just wanted to thank you for what you said about Harold and for creating this fund in his name. Harold changed my life. And knowing that his approach to helping people is going to continue through these programs, that feels like the perfect way to honor him." End quote. Over the following months, the Harold Jensen Memorial Fund provided scholarships for employees pursuing education, emergency assistance for those facing financial crises, and connections to community resources for families dealing with various challenges. But beyond the formal programs, something more subtle, and perhaps more important, began to happen at Blake Industries. The culture began to shift toward greater attention to individual employees, more awareness of personal struggles that affected professional performance, and more willingness to extend help and support across all levels of the organization. Connor tracked the metrics carefully. Employee satisfaction scores improved significantly. Turnover decreased, particularly among support staff, who had previously felt invisible and undervalued. Productivity increased, as people felt more secure and supported in their personal lives. The bottom line impact was measurable and positive, but Connor found that he cared less about the financial benefits than about the human ones. 6 months after Harold Jensen's funeral, Connor stood in the same chapel where he had delivered his impromptu eulogy. This time he was there for a celebration rather than a memorial service. The community organization that Harold had quietly supported for years was dedicating a new facility for job training and social services, funded in part by a donation from Blake Industries and named the Harold Jensen Community Center. Many of the same people who had attended Harold's funeral were there for the dedication, along with dozens of others whose lives had been touched by Harold's kindness over the years. Rosa Valdez cut the ribbon, and Miguel gave a speech about Harold's vision of community support and mutual aid. Jennifer Martinez, now a manager in the marketing department, spoke about how Harold's example had inspired her to volunteer as a mentor for young professionals. Connor was asked to say a few words, and he found himself thinking about how much had changed since that day, when he had stood in an empty chapel and realized how little he had known about one of his most valuable employees. Harold Jensen taught us that leadership isn't about position or title or authority, Connor told the gathered crowd. Leadership is about seeing people who need help and finding ways to provide it. It's about using whatever resources and connections you have to make other people's lives better. It's about understanding that we're all connected, that everyone's success contributes to everyone else's success, and that lifting others up is the most important work any of us can do." End quote. Connor looked around at the faces in the crowd, many of them familiar now from his walks through the Blake Industries offices, his conversations with employees at all levels, his growing understanding of the complex web of relationships and dependencies that made any organization function. Harold Jensen spent 30 years building this community, one relationship at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one problem solved at a time. He didn't do it for recognition or reward. He did it because he understood something fundamental about human nature, that we're all better when we help each other be better. This center will continue Harold's work, but more than that, it will remind all of us that we have the opportunity every day to be leaders in Harold's tradition, to see needs and meet them, to build connections and strengthen raw community, to make the world a little bit better by paying attention to the people around us. As Connor spoke, he thought about the journey that had brought him to this moment, from that first impersonal email notification about an employee death, to this celebration of a life that had touched dozens of others in meaningful ways. He thought about the lessons he was still learning, about what it meant to lead with purpose, to use power and resources in service of others, to measure success not just in financial terms, but in human terms. The Harold Jensen Community Center would serve hundreds of people over the years, providing job training, social services, educational opportunities, and support for families facing various challenges. But its most important function might be as a reminder that extraordinary impact often comes from ordinary people who simply pay attention to the needs around them and respond with generosity and creativity. After the dedication ceremony, Connor walked slowly back to his car, taking time to speak with people he had met through his exploration of Harold's legacy. Each conversation reinforced his understanding of how much he had missed during his years of focusing exclusively on high-level strategy and financial performance. The real work of building a successful organization, he now understood, happened at the human level, in the relationships between individuals, in the daily acts of support and encouragement that created the conditions for everyone to do their best work. Driving back through the city streets, Connor reflected on how his perspective on leadership had evolved. He still cared about profitability and growth and competitive advantage, but those goals now felt incomplete without a corresponding focus on the welfare of the people who made business success possible. Harold Jensen had shown him that true leadership meant paying attention to individuals, understanding their challenges and aspirations, and finding ways to help them succeed, not just as employees, but as human beings. The Harold Jensen Memorial Fund continued to grow and evolve, supporting not just Blake Industries employees, but also partnering with other companies to create broader networks of support for working families. Connor found himself speaking at business conferences about the connection between employee well-being and organizational success, sharing Harold's story as an example of how individual acts of kindness could create ripple effects that transformed entire corporate cultures. But the most meaningful changes were the quiet ones, the daily interactions that reflected Harold's approach to seeing and serving others. Connor's assistant Patricia told him that employees throughout the company were taking more interest in each other's welfare, offering help with everything from transportation problems to childcare emergencies, educational goals. Managers were paying closer attention to signs that their team members might be struggling with personal challenges. The company's informal networks of mutual support were strengthening and expanding, creating the kind of community that Harold had built through his individual efforts. 1 year after Harold Jensen's death, Blake Industries held its first annual Harold Jensen Day of Service, when employees throughout the company spent a day volunteering with community organizations that provided social services and support for working families. Connor participated by spending his day at a job training center that helped people develop skills for employment in various industries. He found himself thinking about Harold as he worked alongside volunteers and participants, understanding more clearly how Harold must have felt when he used his time and energy to solve problems that seemed small individually but added up to transformative change in people's lives. At the job training center, Connor met Maria Santos, a single mother of two who was learning computer skills while working nights as a hotel housekeeper. Her story reminded him of the employees Harold had helped over the years, people who were working hard to improve their circumstances, but facing barriers that seemed insurmountable without support and guidance. Connor found himself naturally falling into Harold's pattern of listening carefully and thinking about connections and resources that might help. By the end of the day, he had introduced Maria to the manager of Blake Industries' IT department, who was looking for entry-level technicians and was impressed by Maria's determination and quick learning. The connection led to Maria being hired for a part-time position that allowed her to continue her training while earning better wages than her hotel job provided. 6 months later, she was promoted to full-time status, with benefits that included tuition assistance for her continued education. Connor followed her progress the way Harold might have, checking in periodically to see how she was adjusting to her new role and whether she needed any additional support. These individual success stories accumulated over time, creating a narrative of impact that went far beyond traditional business metrics. The Harold Jensen Memorial Fund had assisted over 200 employees and their families in its first year, providing everything from emergency financial assistance to educational scholarships to connections with community resources. But the fund's most important achievement was less tangible. The way it had institutionalized Harold's approach of seeing employees as whole human beings whose personal challenges and aspirations were legitimate concerns for their employer. Connor began to understand that Harold Jensen had been practicing what business schools now called stakeholder capitalism, the idea that companies should serve not just shareholders, but all the people affected by business decisions. Harold had never heard the academic term, but he had lived the principle every day, understanding instinctively that the success of Blake Industries depended on the well-being of everyone who worked there, not just the executives and managers who made strategic decisions. This realization led Connor to make more fundamental changes in how Blake Industries operated. The company began measuring and reporting on employee well-being metrics alongside financial performance indicators. They established partnerships with healthcare providers, child care centers, elder care services, and educational institutions to create comprehensive support systems for employees facing various life challenges. They redesigned their physical workspaces to include quiet areas for personal phone calls, lactation rooms for new mothers, and flexible arrangements that allowed people to balance work responsibilities with family obligations. Most importantly, they began training all managers and supervisors in Harold's approach to leadership, teaching them to pay attention to individual employees' needs and to think creatively about how company resources could be used to support personal success alongside professional development. This training went far beyond traditional management development programs, focusing on emotional intelligence, active listening, and problem-solving skills that enabled leaders to respond effectively to the complex challenges that employees brought to work every day. Connor found himself becoming something of an evangelist for Harold's philosophy of leadership through service. He spoke at industry conferences and business schools about the connection between employee well-being and organizational performance, using Harold's story to illustrate how individual acts of kindness could scale up to transform entire corporate cultures. The response was consistently positive, with other business leaders expressing interest in implementing similar approaches in their own organizations. But Connor was careful never to position himself as the originator of these ideas. Every speech, every interview, every article began with Harold Jensen's story, with the recognition that Connor had learned these lessons from a janitor who had never held a management position, but who had understood leadership better than most CEOs. This humility was not just appropriate, but strategic, as it reinforced the central message that wisdom and insight could come from anywhere in an organization, that titles and salaries were not reliable indicators of who had the most to contribute. The business press began to take notice of the changes at Blake Industries. Fortune magazine featured the company in a cover story about innovative approaches to employee engagement, highlighting the Harold Jensen Memorial Fund and the cultural transformation it had sparked. Harvard Business Review published a case study about Blake Industries' employee support programs, examining how investments in individual well-being had generated measurable improvements in productivity, retention, and overall organizational performance. Connor was invited to speak at the World Economic Forum about stakeholder capitalism and the future of corporate responsibility. Standing on that international stage, addressing business leaders from around the globe, he thought about Harold Jensen mopping floors in the empty halls of Blake Industries, probably never imagining that his quiet acts of kindness would someday be discussed as a model for how global corporations should operate. But the recognition and publicity, while gratifying, were less important to Connor than the daily evidence that Harold's approach was making a real difference in individual lives. Employees throughout Blake Industries were taking more interest in each other's welfare, creating informal networks of support that went far beyond what any formal program could provide. People were more willing to ask for help when they needed it, and more willing to offer help when they could provide it. The workplace felt more like a community, and less like a collection of individuals competing for advancement and recognition. Connor received regular updates about the impact of the various programs inspired by Harold's example. The Employee Assistance Coordinator, a position created specifically to institutionalize Harold's approach to connecting people with resources, was handling over 50 cases per month, everything from financial emergencies to family crises to educational goals to career transitions. The success rate was remarkable, with most people finding solutions to their challenges and often going on to help others facing similar situations. The mentorship programs had expanded beyond traditional professional development to include personal life skills, financial literacy, parenting support, and other areas where employees expressed interest in key learning and growth. Senior employees were volunteering as mentors, not just for professional advancement, but for life navigation, sharing their experience and wisdom in ways that created bonds across different levels of the organizational hierarchy. The educational partnerships were producing measurable results as well, with over 100 employees enrolled in degree programs, professional certification courses, and skills training that would advance their careers within Blake Industries or prepare them for opportunities elsewhere. Connor had initially worried that investing in employee education might increase turnover as people became qualified for jobs at other companies, but the opposite had happened. Employees who felt supported in their personal and professional development were more loyal, more engaged, and more likely to stay with Blake Industries long term. Perhaps most importantly, the culture of mutual support was extending beyond Blake Industries into the broader community. Employees were volunteering with local service organizations, mentoring young people from disadvantaged backgrounds, and creating connections between Blake Industries and community groups that needed corporate support and partnership. Harold's vision of everyone helping everyone else was expanding beyond the workplace to encompass the entire ecosystem of relationships and dependencies that made communities function effectively. 2 years after Harold Jensen's funeral, Connor found himself back at Riverside Memorial Chapel, this time for a celebration rather than a service. The chapel was hosting a community appreciation event, recognizing individuals and organizations that had made significant contributions to local service programs. Harold Jensen was being honored posthumously as the inspiration for a network of support that now included dozens of businesses, schools, and nonprofit organizations. The chapel was packed this time, with over 300 people attending to celebrate Harold's legacy and the ongoing impact of his approach to community building. Connor was struck by the contrast with Harold's funeral, when barely 20 people had gathered to say goodbye. Now, hundreds of people whose lives had been touched directly or indirectly by Harold's influence were coming together to recognize his contribution and commit to continuing his work. Rosa Valdez, now retired from Blake Industries but actively involved in coordinating community service programs, served as the master of ceremonies. She began by reading excerpts from the dozens of letters that had been submitted by people whose lives had been changed by Harold's kindness or by programs inspired by his example. The stories were remarkably similar to the ones Connor had first heard 3 years earlier, but now they numbered in the hundreds, a testament to how Harold's individual acts of service had multiplied and spread throughout the Maine community. Miguel, the security guard who had first told Connor about Harold's character, spoke about how Harold's example had inspired him to become more involved in helping his neighbors and co-workers. "Harold showed us that you don't need permission to help people," Miguel said. "You don't need a title or a budget or official authority. You just need to pay attention to what people need and then figure out how to provide it." Harold was a leader because he served others, not because anyone gave her a leadership position. Jennifer Martinez, now a vice president at Blake Industries and active in several community organizations, talked about how Harold's influence had shaped her approach to management and community involvement. "Harold taught me that leadership is fundamentally about relationships, about understanding people as individuals and helping them succeed in whatever way success means to them. He never used those words, but he lived that principle every single day." When Connor was called to speak, he found himself thinking about how much he had learned since that day when Patricia had mentioned Harold's funeral and he had realized he didn't know who Harold Jensen was. The journey from ignorance to understanding to action had transformed not just his approach to business, but his understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. "Harold Jensen taught me that true success isn't measured by what you accumulate, but by what you give away," Connor told the gathering. "It's not about how high you climb, but about how many people you help climb with you." Harold never owned a company, or managed a department, or had his name in the newspaper, but he built something more valuable than any of those achievements. He built a network of relationships based on mutual support and genuine care for other people's well-being." End quote. Connor looked around the packed chapel, seen faces he recognized from Blake Industries, and faces he had met through various community service activities, all connected by their commitment to Harold's vision of everyone bright, helping everyone else. "The programs and funds and partnerships that we've created in Harold's memory are important, but they're not the most important part of his legacy. The most important part is the way Harold changed how we think about our responsibilities to each other. How he showed us that we all have the power to make other people's lives better if we're willing to pay attention and take action." End quote. Connor paused, thinking about the individual stories he had heard over the past 2 years, the lives that had been changed by someone following Harold's example of seeing needs and meeting them. Harold Jensen proved that you don't need to be rich or powerful or famous to have a profound impact on the world. You just need to care about other people and be willing to act on that caring. You need to understand that everyone you meet is fighting battles you know nothing about, and that small acts of kindness can make the difference between someone giving up and someone persevering." End quote. As Connor concluded his remarks, he reflected on how Harold's story had become his own story as well, how learning about Harold's life had changed the trajectory of his own career and personal development. The shy, invisible janitor had become Connor's most important teacher, showing him what authentic leadership looked like, and challenging him to use his resources and influence in service of others, rather than just in pursuit of profit and recognition. The celebration concluded with the announcement of several new initiatives inspired by Harold's example. A coalition of local businesses was establishing a community emergency fund to provide assistance for families facing financial crises. The school district was creating a mentorship program connecting high school students with working professionals who could provide guidance about career planning and life skills. Several churches and community organizations were partnering to provide job training, childcare, and other support services for people working to improve their economic circumstances. All of these programs were inspired by Harold Jensen's approach to seeing needs and finding ways to meet them, but they represented a scaling up of his individual efforts into systematic community-wide initiatives. Harold's quiet acts of service had become a model for how entire communities could organize themselves around mutual support and shared responsibility for everyone's well-being. As people filed out of the chapel after the celebration, Connor lingered to speak with individuals he had met through his involvement in various Harold Jensen-inspired programs. Each conversation reinforced his understanding of how transformative it could be when people felt genuinely seen and supported by their community. The business benefits were significant and measurable, but the human benefits were even more important. The way people flourished when they felt valued and cared for as individuals, rather than just as employees or community members. Walking home through the city streets that evening, Connor thought about the journey that had brought him from that initial email notification about Harold Jensen's death to this celebration of Harold's lasting impact on hundreds of lives. The transformation had been gradual but profound, changing not just Connor's approach to business, but his entire understanding of what it meant to live a successful and meaningful life. Harold Jensen had died alone, with no family to mourn him, and few people initially planning to attend his funeral. But his true memorial was not in any building or fund or program named in his honor. His memorial was in the lives he had touched, the people he had helped, the culture of caring he had created through 30 years of quiet service. That memorial would continue growing and expanding, as long as people remembered Harold's example and chose to follow it in their own relationships and communities. Connor reached his apartment building and rode the elevator to his penthouse, looking out at the lights of the city below. Somewhere in those lights were hundreds of people whose lives had been made better by Harold Jensen's kindness and by the kindness of others who had been inspired by Harold's example. The invisible janitor had created a legacy that would outlast any corporate empire, a network of human connections based on service and compassion rather than profit and competition. As Connor prepared for bed that night, he thought about the next day's schedule, the meetings and decisions and strategic initiatives that would occupy his time as CEO of Blake Industries. But he also thought about the individual employees he would encounter, the opportunities to notice needs and offer support, the daily chances to follow Harold Jensen's example of leadership through service. The janitor who had cleaned Connor's office for 30 years without Connor ever really seeing him had become Connor's most important guide for how to use power and resources in ways that honored the dignity and potential of every person. Harold Jensen had attended no one's funeral, but his own funeral had been attended by a CEO who learned from Harold's example how to transform a company and a community. The man who had worked in the shadows had cast a light that continued to illuminate the path forward for everyone willing to see leadership as service, success as contribution, and life's purpose as making other people's lives better. In the end, Harold Jensen had achieved the kind of immortality that mattered most, living on in the actions and attitudes of people committed to building the kind of world he had worked to create, one relationship at a time, one act of kindness at a time, one life made better at a time.